They threatened our planet. Humanity's retaliation left the galaxy stunned. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the normal quiet of an observation post at 0300 hours, when the overnight crew moves slowly and speaks in low voices, and the hum of the ventilation system becomes the loudest thing in the room. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that falls when 23 trained professionals all stop what they are doing at exactly the same moment and stare at the same point in space. I was standing at my console with a cup of cold coffee in my hand when Lieutenant Owen Price said, very quietly, "Commander Vasquez, you need to see this." I had been the commanding officer of Earth Defense Observation Post Kepler 7 for 4 years. I had seen solar flares that lit up every instrument we had. I had tracked debris fields, monitored satellite trajectories, and logged 11,000 hours of watching an empty sky. In all of that time, Owen Price had never once used that particular tone of voice. I put down the coffee and walked to his station. On the central display, 17 objects had appeared in high orbit above Earth. They had not traveled there. They had not been detected approaching. One moment the sky was empty. The next moment it was not. The objects were enormous, each one larger than any human-built structure ever placed in space. They held perfect formation above the Pacific Ocean, arranged in a pattern that no natural phenomenon could produce. "How long?" I asked. 14 seconds, Price said. "They just appeared. No approach vector. No FTL signature we've ever cataloged. Nothing." I looked at the shapes on the display. They were dark, angular, built in a way that suggested intelligence, but not human intelligence. Not anything close to it. The lines were too deliberate. The proportions were wrong, in a way I could not immediately explain. They looked like something designed by a mind that had never once worried about whether things were beautiful. "Get me a channel to Joint Command," I said. Now, the room was already moving. Analysts were pulling data, running identification sweeps, cross-referencing the shapes against every database we had. Nobody was panicking. That was one thing I had always been proud of regarding my crew, but nobody was calm either. There is a state between panic and calm that soldiers enter when something happens that is genuinely, historically unprecedented, and every person in that room was in that state. The contact request to Joint Command connected in 11 seconds. The face of Admiral Caroline Webb appeared on my secondary screen, and she was already awake, already in uniform, and already looking at the same information I was looking at. "Vasquez," she said, "we see it." "Do we know what they are?" "We have some idea," she said. "Stand by." Those two words landed in my chest like stones dropped into deep water. We have some idea. That meant someone on the ground already knew something. That meant this was not entirely a surprise to everyone. I filed that thought away and kept my face neutral. The alien broadcast began 47 minutes later. It did not come through any channel we controlled. It did not use any frequency we had assigned. It simply began, on every human communication device simultaneously, on every satellite uplink, on every radio, on every screen connected to any network anywhere on Earth. It came in every major human language, spoken perfectly, with no accent and no hesitation. I heard it in English. "People of the planet designated Earth, you are being addressed by the High Council of the Vocari Dominion. Your world has been assessed and found suitable for resource integration. You will surrender control of your biosphere, your orbital space, and your planetary governance within 72 of your standard hours. Resistance is not a viable option. 11 civilizations before yours were offered this same opportunity. None who refused it continued to exist. The Vocari Dominion does not negotiate. We do not repeat ourselves. Your time begins now." And then the broadcast ended. For exactly 4 seconds, nobody in the observation post made a sound. Then Price said, "Commander, I'm picking up 3 additional vessels in high orbit. Different configuration. They appear to be watching." I looked at the new contacts on his display. 3 ships, smaller than the Vocari fleet, positioned at a distance that kept them clearly separated from the main formation. They had arrived silently, in the same instant the broadcast ended, and they were not doing anything. They were simply there, observing. "Get me IDs on those 3, I said. "Working on it," said Ensign Laura Dean from the signal station. "The configuration doesn't match the Vocari. These are different. 3 different vessel types, actually. One from each. 3 alien species, come to watch humanity receive the same ultimatum 11 others had received. Come to watch us fold. Come to document the moment a young, primitive species looked up at the sky and understood that the universe had already decided what it was going to do to them. The feeds from the surface were already flooding in. Every major city on Earth was broadcasting the same images. People standing in streets, looking up, not at the ships, which were too high and too dark to see with the naked eye, but up, because that was the direction the voice had come from. Up at the sky that had always been a question, and had now become an answer nobody wanted. I watched a square in a city I did not recognize. Thousands of people standing together, completely still, looking at the sky. A child near the camera was holding her mother's hand. The mother was not moving. The child looked up at her mother's face, and then looked up at the sky, and then looked at her mother's face again, trying to understand what the expression meant. I understood it. I had seen it before, in photographs of historical moments, when the world changed so fast that the human mind could not immediately follow. It was the look of a person standing at the edge of something enormous, trying to decide whether to step back or step forward, and knowing that neither choice was really a choice. My secure line chirped. It was Admiral Webb again. Vasquez, I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to not react to what I am about to tell you. Go ahead, Admiral. We have received a secondary message from one of the 3 observing vessels. The species calling itself the Thorali, text only. They are offering to translate for us if we need it. They say they are sorry. Webb paused. They say the Vocari process is swift and painless. They say many of their own people still send remembrances to the 11 erased worlds. They wanted us to know that we will be remembered. I stood very still. They think it is already over, I said. They are absolutely certain it is already over, Webb said. Every civilization these 3 species have ever witnessed go through this process has surrendered. Most surrendered within the first 12 hours. A few held out longer. None made it to 72. And what do? There was a pause on the line. It lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the connection was still active. That, Admiral Webb said, is what I am calling to tell you. In 6 hours, you are going to be transported to a secure facility. There are things about this situation that you do not yet know. Things that change the calculation considerably. What kind of things? The kind that will explain why I and every senior officer in Joint Command have been sleeping 4 hours a night for the past 3 years, getting ready for exactly this moment. She let that sit for a second. Get some rest, Commander. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day, for us, and considerably more so for the Vocari. She ended the connection. I turned back to the observation window. The 17 Vocari ships hung in the dark above Earth, enormous, and absolute, and utterly certain of themselves. The 3 observer vessels waited at their careful distance. On the surface, billions of people were looking up at a sky that had just told them they had 72 hours to stop being a free species. I thought about the Thorali diplomat's message. We will be remembered. I thought about the 11 civilizations that had received the same broadcast, in the same perfect translation of their own languages, and the long silence that had followed each of them. Then I thought about what Webb had said. 3 years. Sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 years. Getting ready. I looked at the Vocari fleet, and I felt something shift in my chest that I did not immediately have a word for. It was not hope exactly. It was not confidence. It was something older than either of those things. Something that lived in the part of the human mind that goes quiet and steady right before it commits completely to a direction. I sent a polite, formal reply to the Thorali diplomat. I thanked them for their condolences. I told them we appreciated the offer of translation. I told them that humanity was taking the situation under careful consideration. I did not tell them what I was beginning to suspect, that the Vocari had spent so long collecting certainties that they had forgotten to account for the one variable that makes certainty dangerous. They had never met anything like us. Not once, not ever. And in 66 hours, they were going to find out exactly what that meant. I had been inside classified facilities before. I had held clearances at levels that most military officers never reach. I had seen things that did not appear in any public record, and never would. None of that prepared me for what I found at the bottom of a freight elevator in the Atacama Desert at 5 o'clock in the morning. 3,000 feet below the surface of the Earth. The elevator descended for what felt like a very long time. When the doors opened, I stepped into a corridor that stretched further than I could see, lit by strips of clean white light embedded in the ceiling. The air smelled like machinery, and something else I could not identify, something sharp and faintly electric, the smell of systems operating at the edge of their capacity. General Frank Nolan was waiting for me. I had never met him in person. I knew him by reputation, which was considerable. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had never entirely stopped being the infantry soldier he had been at 22, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of face that does not move much regardless of what is happening around it. He extended a hand and I shook it. "Commander Vasquez," he said. "Good. You made good time. General, what is this place?" He smiled, which I had not expected. Not a wide smile, not theatrical in any way, just a brief, quiet expression that contained something I would spend the next 12 hours understanding. "This," he said, "is the reason we are not afraid." He turned and walked, and I followed him down the corridor. He talked as he walked, in the same unhurried way that a person uses when they are telling a story they have told many times in their head, but never out loud. He talked about a signal, intercepted 40 years ago by a listening array that no longer officially existed, deep in the Nevada desert, a signal in a language nobody recognized, carrying data that took 11 years to partially decode, data that described, in precise and unsentimental terms, a species called the Vocari, their history, their reach, their method. 40 years ago, he said, a small group of people who held enormous power and had no interest in public credit made a decision. They decided not to announce the signal. They decided not to call a global summit, or write a public paper, or brief a head of state. They decided, instead, to start building. The corridor opened into a room the size of a football stadium. I stopped walking. The room was full of ships. Not the orbital platforms or communication satellites or the small, practical vessels that populated the public side of Earth's space program. These were warships, real ones, large, angular, built with a purpose that had nothing to do with science or exploration. There were dozens of them in this chamber alone, suspended in scaffolding, surrounded by crews of technicians working in focused silence. "There are 4 facilities like this one," Nolan said, coming to stand beside me. 3 others, on 3 other continents, and the orbital network, which you will not be able to see from the ground." "How many ships?" I asked. "In total? More than you would guess. Fewer than we would prefer, but enough." He let me look for a moment, before continuing. "The Vocari have subjugated or erased 43 civilizations over 4,000 years. We found records of all of them in the decoded signal. Every one of them was more technologically advanced than humanity was when this program began. Several of them were more advanced than we are now. Then how? Every single one of them," he said, "tried to negotiate, or tried to run, or tried to surrender on terms. The Vocari have never encountered a civilization that simply decided to prepare for war and then fight one." He looked at the ships. Every civilization they subjugated had built their technology around exploration, around communication, around understanding. None of them had spent the majority of their recorded history finding better ways to defeat things that wanted to kill them. "But we have," I said. "We have been doing almost nothing else for 200,000 years, Nolan said. "It is arguably the thing we are best at." He took me deeper into the facility. The first thing he showed me was the kinetic array, a set of launch systems capable of accelerating dense metal projectiles to a significant fraction of the speed of light. No explosive payload. No guidance system. Pure physics. An object moving at that speed carries energy that conventional weapons cannot match, and it cannot be jammed or redirected by any countermeasure the Vocari had ever needed to develop, because no species had ever thought to use something so brutally simple against them. "They have energy shielding," a young engineer named Patrick Cole explained to me, pulling up schematics on a wall display. "Very good shielding, designed to disperse directed energy, particle beams, plasma weapons. The physics of their shielding is elegant. It works beautifully against everything they have ever faced. But not against a solid metal bar moving at those speeds," I said. "At sufficient velocity, the kinetic energy exceeds the dispersal capacity of any known shielding system By roughly 3 orders of magnitude, Cole said. He said it without particular drama, the way a person describes a thing they have spent years confirming and are no longer excited about, just certain of. The shield absorbs it for approximately 4 milliseconds, and then it stops existing. He showed me the drone systems next. Thousands of autonomous units, small enough that a single Vocari warship's sensors would register each one as debris or interference, capable of coordinating in swarms through a decentralized network that had no central node to destroy. Take out one drone and the rest adapted. Take out 100, and the swarm reorganized around the gap. The Vocari had never faced a weapon system with no brain to target. What about their numbers? I asked. 17 ships above us right now. You said they have a main fleet. They do, Nolan said. Significantly larger. What is above us now is what they send for civilizations they classify as low threat. A standard subjugation force. More than enough for everything they have ever needed it for. And we are classified as low threat. We were classified as low threat, he said. Past tense. He brought me to a room where a team of analysts sat at workstations surrounding a 3-dimensional display of the solar system. In the display, small blue markers were clustered in positions that did not match any public record of Earth space assets. They were already in position, those markers, already where they needed to be. 40 years, I said. You have been doing this for 40 years, and nobody talked. People did talk, Nolan said quietly. Some of them talked to the wrong people. Some of them had accidents. Some of them simply could not be allowed to take actions that would have warned the Vocari that we knew they were coming. I will not apologize for that. I will not pretend it was clean. He looked at the display. Nothing about this is clean, Commander. We took resources that could have fed people and built weapons instead. We made decisions in secret that should have been made publicly. We did things that will not look good in any honest history of this period. He turned to look at me directly. But those 11 civilizations are gone, he said, and I decided a long time ago that the most important thing was to make sure that sentence would never be spoken about Earth, whatever it cost, whatever I had to carry afterward. I did not have an answer to that. I was not sure there was one. I spent the next 8 hours moving through the facility, being briefed by engineers and tacticians and analysts who had dedicated careers of work to a project that the world did not know existed. I met a woman named Dr. Helen Gray, who had spent 19 years reverse engineering the Vocari sensor frequencies from the intercepted signal, and who could tell me, to within a margin of error measured in meters, exactly where each of those 17 ships could not see. I met a pilot named Captain Danny Shaw who had been flying the cloaked deep space vessels for 6 years, running positioning exercises and approach runs in the dark beyond the moon, rehearsing an attack that everyone in the room had spent a long time hoping they would never actually need to execute. "Are you ready?" I asked him. He considered the question with the thoughtfulness of a person who does not say things he does not mean. "I've been ready for 2 years," he said. "But honestly, Commander, what I am most looking forward to is not the fight. It is the look on their faces when they realize the fight is happening." He said it without bitterness or anger, or the hot energy of someone who wants revenge. He said it the way a craftsman talks about a piece of work they have been careful about for a long time and are satisfied with. At hour 48 of the 72, the Vocari sent a second transmission. This one was not a broadcast. It was targeted specifically at Earth's government frequencies, encoded in a way that made it clear they knew exactly which channels we used. It contained no words. It contained a visual file. The file showed what had happened to the Ceralian homeworld when the Ceralian people chose, 400 years ago, not to comply. I watched it. I made myself watch all of it. I do not think it is useful to describe in detail what the file contained. I will say only that it lasted 11 minutes, and that it was thorough, and that there was nothing in it that was accidental or incidental. Every element of it was intended to communicate a single message to any watching species. This is what non-compliance produces. This is final. This is certain. The Vocari sent it as a weapon. They had used it before, presumably with success. A species that sees that file with 47 hours left on their clock, and no resources, and no preparation, and no hope, has very limited options. I watched the faces of the analysts in the room as they viewed it. The room went very quiet. I saw people's jaws set. I saw people look away, and then look back, because they felt they owed it to the Ceralians to not look away. I saw a young man named Corporal Eddie Walsh sit very still for a long moment, with his eyes closed, and then open them and go back to his work, with a focus that had a different quality than the focus he had shown before. The Vocari had sent that file to break something. Instead, they had made a room full of people who were already committed to fighting them feel the exact reason why that commitment could never be conditional. I sent a report to Nolan's office. One line. Whatever hesitation existed in this building does not exist anymore. His reply came back in under a minute. Good. Rest if you can. We start in 22 hours. I did not rest. I do not think anyone in that facility rested. But we were ready long before the 22 hours were up, and the Vocari above us were still completely certain that they were waiting for a species to crumble, and the gap between what they believed and what was actually true was about to close in one direction only. 12 minutes. That was how long was left on the Vocari clock when Earth broadcast its response. Not a surrender, not a request for negotiation, not the terrified, half-coherent appeal of a civilization trying to buy more time. The transmission was short, precise, and broadcast on the Vocari's own primary communication frequency. It was delivered in their language, translated by the same systems that had spent decades picking apart the intercepted signal word by word. Your 72 hours have elapsed. Humanity does not surrender. We consider this matter open. That was all. I was on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Resolute when we sent it. The Resolute was not the largest ship in our fleet, but it was the fastest, and it had been positioned for the past 11 hours in a location that the Vocari fleet's sensors had confirmed, through the work of people like Dr. Helen Gray, was a complete blind spot, a gap in their detection field created by the overlapping interference of their own shielding arrays. A gap they did not know was a gap because no one had ever thought to look for one before. Captain Danny Shaw was at the helm. He did not look at me when the transmission went out. He was watching his instruments with the complete, unself-conscious concentration of someone who has run the same sequence in their head approximately 10,000 times and is now finally running it in the real world. All units confirm ready, said Lieutenant Owen Price, who had been transferred from Kepler 7 to serve as my communications officer because I had refused to go into this without him. Strike Package 1 is locked. Drone swarms report full coordination. Kinetic arrays report charge at 100%. Vocari response? I asked. They are broadcasting on all frequencies, Price said. Audio translation incoming. He paused. They are repeating their original ultimatum. They think our message was a malfunction, or a mistranslation. Of course they did. In 4,000 years of doing this, the message they had just received from us had never happened before. Their system had no category for it. The most sophisticated military intelligence network in this region of the galaxy, and it genuinely could not process the concept that the answer might be no. 30 seconds to engagement window, Shaw said. I thought about the Cerealian homeworld. I thought about the 11 names on that list of erased civilizations. I thought about the Thorali diplomat who had sent us a kind note about how we would be remembered, fully certain that we were already finished. Captain Shaw, I said, you have command of the engagement. He nodded once. Strike Package 1, he said. Execute. What happened in the next 90 seconds happened very fast and in a great deal of places at once. The kinetic arrays, positioned in locations the Vocari had assessed as empty space, fired simultaneously. The calculations had been running for years. Every shot had a specific target, a specific point of impact, calculated to strike before the Vocari fleet's AI could register that an attack was occurring and begin countermeasures. The first 6 shots reached their targets in the same instant. The Vocari did not have time to raise secondary shielding because they were not in secondary shielding mode. They were in standard orbital holding pattern. They had been waiting for a civilization to surrender, and their systems were configured accordingly. 3 capital ships ceased to function in the first second of engagement. The drone swarms deployed in the second, separating from their launch vehicles and distributing across the engagement volume in a pattern that the Vocari fleet AI immediately attempted to classify. The classification took longer than it should have, because the swarms did not behave like any weapon system in the Vocari's records. They moved like weather. They moved like something alive and thinking in thousands of places at once, because they were. On the Resolute's bridge, We were watching the engagement on a display that translated the sensor data into a visual representation that human minds could follow. The Vocari fleet, which had been sitting in perfect, confident formation for 72 hours, was now a formation in which 3 ships were simply gone, and the remaining 14 were attempting to respond to an attack from a direction their sensors still had not fully identified. "They're targeting the kinetic arrays," Price reported. "Energy weapons. Direct fire. Array response? Dispersal shields active, redirecting 63% of incoming energy. 2 arrays have taken damage, both still operational." The dispersal shields. Another thing the Vocari had never encountered. Their energy weapons were calibrated to overwhelm the kind of shields that other species built. They were not calibrated for a shield that absorbed the energy and expelled it sideways. The physical principle was something a human engineer named Dr. Nadia Brooks had worked out 12 years ago, in a facility very much like the one I had visited in the Atacama, and it worked exactly as well as she had calculated it would. "Drone swarms engaging," Shaw said. "Phase 2. The swarms hit the Vocari fleet from underneath, targeting propulsion systems and sensor arrays. Individually, each drone carried a payload that would not trouble a capital ship. Collectively, arriving in the thousands from angles that the fleet's defensive guns could not cover simultaneously, they were something different. They were relentless, in a way that did not need to be brave, because there was no singular brain inside them to intimidate or overwhelm. You could destroy 100 of them, and the remaining swarm would redistribute and continue, and you would have spent the energy and time of destroying 100 targets to accomplish exactly nothing. I monitored the Vocari command frequency. Dr. Helen Gray's translation team was working in real time, feeding me updates. The Vocari commanders were issuing orders. That was expected. The orders were efficient and tactically sound, and showed the kind of practiced confidence of a command structure that had run this sequence many times before. The problem was that the sequence they were running was the sequence for suppressing a defensive response from a panicking civilization that had just attempted to fight back with whatever small assets it could scrape together. It was not the sequence for an engagement with a prepared, patient, purpose-built military force that had spent 4 decades designing specifically to fight them. "Commander," Price said, "I have translation on the Vocari flagship, Admiral rank communication." "Read it." "They are asking their own intelligence systems to confirm target identification. They want to verify that the attacking units are human in origin." I almost said something. I stopped myself. But the feeling in my chest at that moment was a complicated one. They still did not fully believe it. Even as their ships went dark and their formations broke and their weapons discharged into dispersal shields and their sensor systems tried and failed to get a clean read on drone swarms that moved like liquid, some part of the Vocari command structure was still certain that this could not be what it appeared to be. "Confirm for them," I said to Price. "Tell them yes. Every single thing hitting their fleet right now is human-made, human-designed, human-launched. I want them to know that clearly, before anything else happens." Price transmitted the confirmation. The response from the Vocari flagship came back in 40 seconds. It was not in their tactical communication format. It came through on an open broadcast channel. Price translated it live. "This is not possible. Your civilization was assessed. You are a Class 2 designation. You have no capacity for..." The flagship's communication went offline. Not because we had targeted it. Because 2 of our kinetic projectiles, fired in the first wave from positions on opposite sides of the engagement volume, had reached it at the same moment. "Flagship is down," Shaw reported. For 4 seconds, the Vocari fleet did nothing. Not because they were incapacitated, because their command structure had just lost its head, and the subordinate commanders were running through contingency protocols that had never been designed for this contingency. Then they regrouped. I will give them that. They were a capable military force, and their subordinate commanders were not people who froze. Within those 4 seconds they had restructured their chain of command, and within 30 seconds of that, they had begun a tactical withdrawal that was organized and efficient, and showed exactly the kind of discipline that a fleet develops when it has fought 100 engagements and always won. The problem was that our fleet had spent 11 years running positioning exercises in the dark, and we knew every route out of the engagement volume, and we had assets on each of those routes already. "Pursuit units are active," Price said. "Intercept calculations confirmed." The Vocari were not running, not yet. They were withdrawing. There is a difference. A withdrawal is a tactical repositioning. Running is something different. Running is what happens when a force that has never known defeat suddenly understands, at the level of pure reflex, that it is in a situation it cannot think its way out of. We did not let them get far enough for it to become a rout. That was deliberate. The objective had never been to destroy the Vocari fleet completely. The objective was something more specific and more important. We needed them to go home. We needed them to carry information. Captain Nora Fleming, commanding the pursuit unit from her vessel the Argent, gave me a report at the 30-minute mark. All Vocari vessels have disengaged and are making for their jump threshold, she said. I count 9 surviving ships of the original 17. They are moving at maximum speed. They are not attempting further engagement. Let them go, I said. Do not follow past the threshold. I want every surviving ship to make it back to Vocari space. Fleming paused. You want them to make it back? I want every member of that fleet to spend the rest of their lives telling people what happened here today, I said. I want the account of this engagement in every Vocari military briefing room and every Vocari political chamber for the next century. I want them afraid, not just of our weapons, afraid of what they do not know about us, afraid of what we built that they did not see coming. I want the question, how long have humans been preparing to fight us, to keep them awake? Fleming was quiet for a moment. Understood, Commander, she said. I looked at the display. 9 Vocari ships accelerating toward the edge of our solar system, and behind them, the absence of 8 ships that had arrived here absolutely certain they would never need to leave in a hurry. The 3 observer vessels were still in position. They had not moved during the entire engagement. They were watching now with, I imagined, a very different kind of attention than they had brought to the opening of the 72-hour window. The Thorali Diplomat's channel was active. A request to communicate was blinking on my console. I did not open it yet. I looked around the bridge of the Resolute, at Danny Shaw, who was running post-engagement system checks with the same focused calm he had shown at every point in the last 40 minutes. At Owen Price, who was quietly compiling engagement data with his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly less organized than it had been at the start. At the other 12 people on the bridge, all of them doing their jobs with the kind of precise, purposeful attention that people give to something they have rehearsed for so long that it is now simply the thing they know how to do. Nobody was cheering. Nobody was celebrating. There was no theatrical moment of triumph. There was a woman in the middle of the bridge who sat down, very carefully, in her chair, and pressed both of her hands flat on the surface of her console, and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and then opened them and went back to work. Her name was Specialist Ann Ford, and she had been running tactical calculations for 9 hours straight before the engagement began, and she would run them for another 6 hours before her shift ended. We had lost crew, 3 ships destroyed in the engagement, 31 people. I had their names already. I would spend time with each name later, in the way that you have to do when you are the person who gave the orders. You do not get to put names in a report and move past them. You carry them. That is the cost of command that nobody tells you about when they are offering you the job. I opened the Thorali Diplomat's channel. There was a very long pause on the other end. Commander Vasquez, the translator rendered in careful English. We have witnessed what occurred today. Yes, I said. Another long pause. We did not know, the diplomat said, when we contacted you. We did not know you were. We did not know this was possible. I understand. The other species represented here, the diplomat's voice changed register slightly, the translator working through something more complex. The Sen Collective and the Orvathi have also witnessed. We will need to report what we have observed to our respective governing bodies. Of course, I said. I hope your reports are thorough. A third pause, longer this time. May I ask one question, Commander? Yes. How long, the Thorali diplomat said, have you been preparing for this? I thought about 40 years of silent work 3,000 feet underground. I thought about the engineers, and the pilots, and the analysts, and the people who had made choices they would carry forever, so that Earth would not become the 12th name on a list of erased civilizations. I thought about Dr. Helen Gray and Patrick Cole, and Danny Shaw, and the 31 people whose names were in the report on my console. Long enough, I said. I closed the channel. Outside the Resolute's viewports, the stars were exactly where they had always been. Earth below us was the same blue, the same clouded, the same improbably beautiful thing it had always been. The Volcari ships were crossing the threshold and vanishing into whatever transit method they used, carrying with them the information that would make every calculation they had made about the galaxy and their place in it slightly wrong from now on. This was not over. I knew that. Nolan had said it clearly in the facility. The main Volcari fleet was a different matter entirely. What had happened today was the opening of something, not the closing of it. But something had changed today that had never changed before in 4,000 years of Volcari history. Someone had said no, and had made it mean something, and the universe had heard it. The room smelled different than every other room I had been in since the Volcari fleet arrived. Every military briefing room, every command center, every operations facility I had passed through in the last week had carried the particular atmosphere of a place where people are working very hard, and very fast, and not sleeping enough. Stress has a smell. I know that sounds impossible, but it does not feel impossible when you are inside it. The chamber of the Galactic Conclave smelled like something I had no reference for, like stone and age, and something faintly sweet that did not correspond to any flower or spice in my memory. The seats in the chamber rose in concentric arcs from a circular floor, and they were full, representatives of hundreds of species, most of which I could not identify, filling a room that had been built at a scale intended for exactly this kind of gathering. I stood at the center of the floor. I was wearing a dress uniform that had been sent to me by someone in Joint Command, who thought I should not appear before the Galactic Conclave in the flight suit I had been living in for 11 days. I was the only human in the room. As far as anyone present was aware, I was the only human who had ever been in this room. The Thorali diplomat, whose name I had learned was Senior Consul Vireth Aln, had arranged my presence here. The invitation had not been entirely welcome to every species in the chamber. I understood that from the way certain sections of seats went quiet when I walked in. Not the quiet of shock, but the quiet of deliberate withholding. The quiet of things watching something they are not certain they want to acknowledge. The opening of the session took 40 minutes of procedural exchange that I could not follow, and did not try to. I stood and waited. Waiting is something soldiers are good at. I had learned to use waiting as a time to organize thoughts, and I had many thoughts to organize. Since the engagement 11 days ago, the following things had happened. The 9 surviving Volcari ships had returned to Volcari space, and, as I had expected and intended, they had talked. Within 72 hours of their return, 3 species that had been paying tribute to the Volcari Dominion sent formal communications to Earth. Not diplomatic inquiries, not cautious feelers, formal communications, expressing interest in discussion. Within 5 days, 2 territories that had been under Volcari client status for decades had declared independence. The Volcari Dominion had issued statements promising consequences for these declarations. The statements had, from what our intelligence could gather, not produced the immediate compliance they expected. Something was shifting, small shifts, uncertain shifts, the kinds of shifts that happen when a gravitational center that has held everything in place for a long time suddenly becomes slightly less certain, and every body in orbit feels the change. None of this meant the Volcari were finished. The main fleet existed. It was large and well-equipped, and the commanders of it had presumably spent 11 days receiving very detailed accounts of what had happened at Earth, and were making adjustments accordingly. We had won a first engagement. We had not won a war. I was careful not to think otherwise. The conclave session opened formally, and the first speaker was a representative of a species called the Marinth, who I was told by Vireth Aln had been allies of the Volcari for 600 years. The Marinth representative was speaking at length, and with considerable feeling. The translation system I had been fitted with rendered the speech in a flat, affectless voice that made the emotion strange to listen to. The substance was this: humanity had violated the established protocols of first contact. Humanity had engaged a Dominion fleet without provocation, in contravention of agreements that predated humanity's spaceflight by centuries. Humanity had used concealed weapons systems and tactics that the Conclave had never been informed of, which itself represented a threat to galactic stability. Humanity should be sanctioned. Humanity should be required to dismantle its concealed military assets. Humanity should be placed under Conclave supervision until its intentions could be properly assessed. There were murmurs in the chamber that my translation system characterized, without apparent irony, as general agreement. I waited until the Marinth representative finished. Then I asked to speak. Virith Aln had arranged for this to be permitted, though I gathered it was not without opposition. I walked to the speaking position, and I stood there, and I looked at the room. Hundreds of species. Thousands of years of shared history that I was completely outside of. I was, by any reasonable measure, the least qualified person in this room to speak about galactic politics or interstellar protocol. I had decided in advance not to pretend otherwise. I am going to speak plainly, I said, and let the translation run, because I do not know your protocols well enough to speak any other way, and because I think the subject of this discussion does not benefit from careful framing. I paused. 11 civilizations were erased by the Vokari Dominion. I want to start with that because I think this discussion has spent considerable time on the question of what humanity did, and has not spent adequate time on what was done to 11 other species who sat in chambers like this one, and perhaps expected that the bodies present would not allow what was done to them to happen. The murmur in the room changed texture slightly. I am not here to apologize for the fact that we prepared to defend our world. I am not going to pretend that the weapons systems we built were something we should have disclosed to a galactic community that, as far as we can determine, had no process for protecting civilizations that were not already members of it. We found out about the Vokari through an intercepted signal. We did the reasonable thing, which was to prepare. A representative from the Sen Collective interrupted through the formal interruption protocol, which amounted to a sharp auditory tone that I was told to pause for. Humanity concealed the existence of an advanced militarized program from the Galactic Conclave, the Sen representative said through my translation. This constitutes a violation of the disclosure obligations that apply to all spacefaring civilizations. With respect, I said, humanity was not a member of the Galactic Conclave. We did not know the Galactic Conclave existed until 11 days ago. You cannot violate the disclosure obligations of a body you have never been informed of. Another pause. Furthermore, I said, I would like to ask this chamber a question. Several of the civilizations now represented here were aware of the Vokari's pattern of subjugation. Some of them were aware for centuries, some for longer. I would like someone in this room to stand and tell me how many of those 11 erased civilizations made contact with the Galactic Conclave before their erasure, and what assistance was extended to them. Nobody stood. I let the silence last. I have looked at the records that were available to us, I said. The Ceralians sent a communication 400 years ago to several advanced civilizations asking for intervention. I can see that communication in our intelligence archives. I cannot find a record of a response. The Jorath Collective attempted to negotiate conclave membership as a means of protection 300 years ago. Their application was pending when they were erased. I looked at the room. So I am standing here, being asked to answer for the fact that my species built weapons in secret and used them to defend our world from a fleet that came to take it from us. And I am listening to a chamber of species who watched 11 civilizations disappear and did not do anything about it. Ask me to explain myself. The room was very quiet now. We are not the Vokari, I said. I understand that some members of this body are worried about that. I understand that a species that appears suddenly with a military capacity that nobody knew about is a frightening thing. I want to be honest with you. I cannot tell you what humanity will become. I cannot promise you that we will never make mistakes or poor decisions. We have a long and complicated history of both. I stopped. I let that sit. What I can tell you is what we did not do. We did not use our capacity to take other worlds. We did not build an empire. We built a defense. And when that defense became necessary, we used it for the purpose we built it for, and nothing else. And when we had the opportunity to destroy the Vokari fleet completely, we chose not to, because the objective was never destruction. The objective was to still be here. The chamber was still. I do not know what I expected after that. Discussion, perhaps. More objections. The procedural back and forth of a body that makes decisions slowly and by consensus. I was prepared for a long session. What I was not prepared for was the silence from the highest tier of seats in the chamber, where the Orvathi delegation sat. The Orvathi were the oldest species in the conclave. I had been told by Virith Alm that they had not spoken in formal session in 300 years. Their representative had the appearance of extreme age in a way that seemed to exist independently of species or biology, the quality of something that has witnessed an enormous amount and is in no hurry about anything. The Orvathi representative rose. Every other conversation in the chamber stopped. The translation system rendered the voice as low and even and unhurried. "We have observed," the Orvathi said. "Many species discover they are not alone in this galaxy. The common response is one of two kinds. Either the discovering species becomes afraid and tries to become smaller and quieter, and hopes the universe will ignore them, or the discovering species becomes ambitious and tries to expand and gather and control. We have observed both patterns many times across many thousands of years." The Orvathi looked at me. "We have not before observed a species that looked at the information, built a wall, and then went back to arguing with itself about trade agreements and population distribution. Your species has been aware of a potential existential threat for 40 of your years. In those 40 years, by our observation, you simultaneously maintained the covert military program that we are discussing, conducted 3 significant regional conflicts among your own nations, sent 17 exploratory missions to nearby stellar objects, elected leaders of wildly varying quality, produced several 100 million artistic works of no tactical relevance whatsoever, and apparently never stopped arguing about any of it." The Orvathi paused. "This is not the behavior of a species that wants to conquer. This is the behavior of a species that is simply alive, completely, chaotically, irreversibly alive. We have waited a very long time to observe something like it." They sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. Not the charged, complex quiet of before, a different kind, the kind that follows a statement that most of the people in the room are still processing. I stood at the center of the chamber floor, and I thought about 31 names on a report on a console on the bridge of the Resolute. I thought about Dr. Helen Gray's 19 years. I thought about the child in the square holding her mother's hand, while the whole world tried to understand what was above them. The session continued for 4 more hours. When it ended, no formal sanction had been passed, no resolution to investigate. The Marinth representative looked as though they had a great deal more to say about it, and I expected they would say it in other venues in the coming weeks. The politics of this were not resolved. They would not be resolved quickly or easily. But the Orvathi had spoken, and in 300 years of silence, they had apparently accumulated the kind of authority that made what they said sit in the room long after the meeting ended. Outside the conclave chamber, Virith Aln met me. They walked beside me down a corridor that was built for larger beings than either of us, and for a moment we were simply 2 individuals from 2 species walking in the same direction. "You spoke well," Virith Aln said. "I spoke honestly," I said. "I am not certain those are always the same thing." "In this room, today, they were," the Thorali diplomat said. "The Vokari main fleet is mobilizing, Commander. Our intelligence suggests a response force significantly larger than the subjugation fleet." "I know," I said. "Are you afraid?" I thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. I was afraid of some things. I was afraid of the names on reports that I would carry. I was afraid of the decisions that were going to be necessary, and what making them would do to the people who had to make them. I was afraid of what humanity might become if this went badly, and equally afraid, in a quieter way, of what humanity might become if it went well. "Yes," I said, "some things. But not of the Vokari," Virith Aln said. It was not quite a question. "Not of the Vokari," I said. The Thorali diplomat was quiet for a moment as we walked. "I sent you a message," they said. "When your clock was running, I told you that you would be remembered." "I remember. I would like," Virith Aln said carefully, "to formally withdraw that message." I looked at them. The Thorali face was not built for human expressions, but there was something in the posture, something in the particular angle of attention, that I had started to read in the past 11 days. "Withdrawn," I said. We walked in silence the rest of the corridor, and I thought about the Vokari main fleet moving through deep space toward a confrontation that nobody in the history of their civilization had needed to think carefully about before, and about the people back on Earth who were building and planning and preparing and arguing and creating art and arguing some more, and about the thing the Orvathi had said, and about what it meant to be what we were. Whatever happened next, I thought, They had come to our world and given us 72 hours to stop being free. And the answer had been no. And the answer had been no. With engines and mathematics and 40 years of stubborn, patient, grinding work done by people who were afraid, and did the work anyway. That was the part I wanted to remember. Not the battle, not the chamber, the work. The long, quiet, unwitnessed work of people who decided that the right response to an impossible problem was to sit down and solve it. The star outside my viewport was not the sun. That still surprised me, after a year, looking at a star that was not the sun, and knowing that the star behind me, the one I had watched rise every morning of my childhood, was 43 light-years away, and invisible from here. I do not think you ever entirely get used to that. I think the part of you that is still just a creature that evolved on one particular planet in one particular solar system never stops noticing it. The ship was the Earth defense vessel Endurance, and she was good, larger than the Resolute, quieter, built with the lessons of the engagement, folded into every system and every surface. The crew was 212 people, and they had been out here with me for 7 months, and by this point we knew each other the way you know people when you live and work in close proximity, through situations that matter, not always comfortably, not always without friction, but deeply. Lieutenant Owen Price was still my communications officer. He had gotten a promotion and turned down a posting to Earth so he could stay on the Endurance. He had not explained this decision to me in detail, but I had not asked him to. Some things do not need explaining. Captain Nora Fleming, who had commanded the pursuit unit during the engagement, was my second in command. She ran the ship with an efficiency that made her quietly terrifying to new crew members, and deeply reassuring to those who had been aboard for more than a month. She and I had different approaches to a number of things, and similar approaches to the things that mattered most, which is about the best working relationship you can hope for. The war had lasted 6 months. I had been present for parts of it, and informed about other parts. The Vokari main fleet had been larger than what faced us at Earth, significantly so, and the engagement had been more costly. We had lost more ships. We had lost more people. I had more names to carry than I would spend the rest of my life being fully comfortable with. That is accurate, and I am not going to make it sound cleaner than it was. But we had not fought alone. The 3 species that had contacted us after the first engagement had come through with what they had promised. The Thorali contributed intelligence and logistical support that proved more valuable than we had initially assessed. The Orvathi, who had not engaged in a military action in 2,000 years by their own account, contributed something stranger and harder to quantify. A kind of presence that seemed to communicate to the Vokari that something unprecedented was occurring. And there were others, species that had been paying tribute and had stopped. Species that had been quiet and had chosen, when they saw the balance shifting, to shift with it. Not all of them for pure reasons. Politics is politics in every part of the galaxy, and a species deciding to join a war on the winning side is not the same as a species acting on principle. I did not require pure reasons. I required the coalition to hold, and it held. The Vokari Dominion had not been destroyed. I want to be clear about that. The decision was made at a level above mine, and I agreed with it, not because the Vokari deserved clemency in any simple sense, but because the objective of ending a threat is not the same as the objective of annihilating a species. The Vokari had been forced to cease hostilities, to release all occupied territories, and to withdraw behind a defined boundary, with consequences, if crossed, that were now backed by a coalition they could not dismiss. Whether it would hold was a question for time to answer. The occupied territories were the hardest part of what came after the war. When the Vokari released the worlds they had been holding, we found things that I had read about in the decoded signal, but that reading about had not prepared me for. The 11 erased civilizations were not entirely gone. Remnant populations existed, survivors and their descendants, living under conditions that the Vokari's records described in the clinical language of resource management. It is the kind of language that is designed specifically to make it possible to write things down without appearing to understand what you are writing. I had been one of the first humans to set foot on one of those worlds. I will not describe what we found in any detail here. What I will say is that the doctors and aid workers who came after us, the people who were equipped and trained for what was there, were extraordinary. I have spent my career around military people, and I respect what they do. The people who went to those worlds with medical equipment and language databases and just the willingness to stay and help and not flinch were as brave as anyone I have served with, and I want that on the record. On the recovered worlds we also found something else. Archives. The Vocari were meticulous record keepers. Their documentation of every civilization they had encountered, assessed, and acted upon was preserved in detail that spanned millennia. And in those archives, in the section pertaining to Earth, we found something that none of us had known. The Vocari had first observed Earth 211 years ago. They had been watching since then. Regular observation sweeps, included in their standard monitoring rotation for developing civilizations in their area of interest. And in their assessment files, accumulated over 2 centuries of watching, there was a notation that appeared in the earliest records and was updated and confirmed every 20 or 30 years across the entire span of observation. The notation was brief. Translated from Vocari directly, it read, "Anomalous behavioral pattern. Monitoring advised before action. See Classification Flag 7. Classification Flag 7, in the Vocari assessment system, meant something that I had to have translated twice, because I wanted to be certain I understood it correctly. It meant, potential unpredictable threat. Standard approach may be insufficient. Delay engagement pending further data. They had been afraid of us for 200 years before we knew they existed." When Patrick Cole explained this to me, standing in a briefing room on a planet 3 days' travel from Earth, I sat with the information for a long time before I said anything. "What specifically triggered the flag?" I asked. Cole pulled up the translated document. The earliest assessment describes observed behaviors including, and I am reading directly here, persistent engagement in organized large-scale violent conflict among own species groups, rapid technological innovation under pressure, evidence of planning and preparation on timescales exceeding individual lifetimes, and what the Vocari assessor describes as, I want to make sure I translate this right, an apparent absence of the species-wide self-preservation instinct that standard models predict for civilizations at this developmental stage. I looked at him. "They thought we were strange, because we did not seem to be afraid of dying," Cole said. "We are afraid of dying," I said. "I know," he said. "I think the distinction was that being afraid of dying did not make us stop. The Vocari assessor seems to have found that unexpected." I thought about that for a long time on the journey back to the Endurance. I thought about whether it was something to be proud of, or something more complicated than pride. I thought about the history that produced the thing the Vocari assessor had documented, the long and difficult and sometimes terrible history of a species that had spent most of its existence in conflict, and had somehow also produced music and medicine and mathematics, and the tendency to send care packages to strangers in disasters, all at the same time, as if these things were not contradictions, but simply different expressions of the same underlying restlessness. A species that had never stopped being afraid, but had never let the fear be the last word. The Endurance dropped out of transit at the edge of the Seralian system 2 weeks after I received that briefing. We had been en route for the second half of our journey, following a course established by the Coalition as part of the outreach program for recovered worlds. The Seralians were the most recent of the 11 erased civilizations to have been found, a remnant population of approximately 300,000, far smaller than what their world had once held. They had survived as a group through what appeared to be a combination of geographic isolation and, from what our xenobiologists could determine, a culturally transmitted practice of deliberate obscurity. They had survived by making themselves very difficult to notice for a very long time. It was one of the most specific and impressive acts of collective determination I had ever learned about. They had been aware of the outcome of the war for several months. The Coalition had made sure of that. What we did not know was how they would receive us. The history between humanity and the Seralians was essentially non-existent. We had not been present when they were taken. We had played no part in their survival. We were strangers from a species they had every reason to have complicated feelings about, since a species much like us in terms of apparent capability had done nothing to stop what had happened to them. Owen Price handled the initial communication. He was good at that, better than me in some ways, with a quality of attention and patience that comes across even through translation systems. The Seralian transmission came back 40 minutes after our arrival signal. Price rendered it for me, and I could hear something in his voice when he read it that made me understand it was not a routine report. The Seralians had one question. It had been transmitted by someone identified as a senior council member, which Price told me was the Cerealian equivalent of a governmental leader. The question had been translated carefully, with notation from Price that the translator had flagged several possible interpretations, and this was the most accurate rendering. The question was, how did you know you could win? I sat with it for a long time. There were several answers I could have given. I could have talked about the mathematics, about the kinetic arrays and the drone systems and the 40 years of preparation, and Dr. Helen Gray's 19 years of work on sensor frequencies. All of that was true, and all of it had mattered. But it was not the right answer to the question they were actually asking. I thought about what the Vocari assessor had written 200 years ago. An apparent absence of the species-wide self-preservation instinct. I thought about General Frank Nolan saying, with the tiredness of someone who had made choices he would carry forever, the most important thing was to make sure that sentence would never be spoken about Earth. I thought about 31 names on a report. I thought about the child in the square and her mother's face. I thought about the Orvathi who had waited 300 years to see something like us, and had not said what they meant by that. And the fact that I was still thinking about it. I recorded my response to the Cerealian Council. We did not know, I said. We did not know we could win. Some of the people who built our defense probably believed we could, and some of them probably had serious doubts on quiet nights, and most of them probably moved back and forth between those two positions, depending on the day and how the work was going. What we knew was that we were going to try. Not because we were certain it would work, but because the alternative was to not try. And that was not something we were willing to do. I paused. I cannot tell you that we are good at everything. We are not. We are inconsistent and we argue too much, and we make significant mistakes on a regular basis. And if you looked at the full record of how we have treated each other over our history, you would find things that are very difficult to explain. But somewhere in the part of us that is hard to name, there is something that does not accept a final answer when the final answer is no. Something that treats the word impossible as a problem to work on, rather than a conclusion to accept. Another pause. I do not know if that is wisdom or stubbornness. My honest opinion is that it is stubbornness, mostly, and that the difference between wisdom and stubbornness is sometimes just the outcome. We got an outcome we can work with. We intend to use it well. I looked at the planet on the display. From this distance it was a sphere of brown and green, and the white patterns of cloud cover, looking very much like something that had once held billions of people, and was now learning, slowly, what it meant to hold a future again. We are here, I said, if you want company for what comes next. The Endurance waited in orbit, while the translation processed, and the Cerealian Council deliberated, and the star outside my viewport was not the sun, and the universe went on being what it was. Enormous and old and full of things we had not yet encountered, and problems we had not yet solved, and questions we had not yet thought to ask. I had a ship and a crew, and a list of 31 names, and more stars ahead than behind me. I sat at my console and I waited for the answer, and in the quiet of the waiting I thought that if someone had told me 3 years ago, or 30 years ago, or at any point in the ordinary, complicated, unexceptional life I had led before 17 ships appeared in the sky above the Pacific, that it would come down to this. To a single question from a surviving people on a recovering world, I would not have had any idea what to make of it. But we were here, and we were still free. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. The reply came 40 minutes later. The Cerealian Council had deliberated and spoken, and Owen Price had translated it carefully, with 2 alternate readings noted, and the primary rendering confirmed. It was 2 words. Come down. I stood up from my console. I pulled my jacket straight. I looked at Nora Fleming, who was already giving the landing prep orders, and at Owen Price, who had the particular expression of someone trying very hard to remain professionally composed and not entirely succeeding, and at the 210 other people on this ship, who had come 43 light-years from home, because this was what came next. All right, I said. Let's go. The Endurance began her descent, and the star that was not the sun lit the forward viewports gold, and somewhere below us, a people who had survived the unsurvivable were waiting to meet the species that had decided, a long time ago, in a facility 3,000 feet underground, that stubbornness was a strategy. I hoped we were worth meeting. I thought we had a chance. That, in the end, was the most human thing about all of it. We never knew for certain. We just kept going anyway.
Oh shoot, hold on. Alright, lock in. Are you in my stream? Wait, I think you should mute yourself because what's it called? I can hear myself. So you just connect to, or I don't know. Get it!
Too slow.
No! Like, I'm actually trying to take this serious, bruh. Yes, Tiny. Hey, I'm finna change my name.
Change your name to what?
Suave Rico. Tough or what?
That shit's up.
Yes. Can you? Yeah, you can't shoot on that, but I forgot.
I can. It wouldn't work my magic.
Ooh. Hold on, let me get my mascot. It's over. Oh. Yummy. I'm finna backdoor him. Oh my.